reason, all society is right there, trapped in the cave. And so in this thought experiment, which is probably the best way to describe it, Plato thinks that everyone is stuck down there. They are not in the light of the sun. So everything you see here is technically supposed to be happening in the intelligible realm, but he's describing it to us as if it happened in the real world or in reality. And so what he's saying is everyone's mind is trapped away from the goodness or truth. And it's like they're only seeing shadows of the real thing itself, which, as we've learned, is the least form of truth that there could be. So, as you can imagine, you have the 3D things, the objects right there, but the prisoners can only see the shadows. And so the prisoners have grown up there from when they were born. They've never been able to go outside. And so they think reality is only the shadows. They know nothing apart from the shadows. And so whenever they think about reality, reality to them is the dim darkness of the cave, only seeing shadows. That is their utmost truth. And according to Plato, that's the least amount of truth there is. And so if all society is in there, Plato thinks all of society is seeing the world in the least truthful way possible, but they don't understand that. They think that they're seeing the world in the most truth possible. And so as the analogy goes, Plato says, the philosopher is able to escape this cave, theoretically, and is able to run up the cave and out, and finally go into the light, or finally be unchained from the faraway depths of the cave. And as the philosopher goes outside, he is enlightened to what the truth of reality actually is. And it's almost as if whenever you're asleep and you get woken up by the lights being turned on, it's that feeling as the philosopher goes out of the cave and looks around. It's like this unimaginable power and light is shining into the philosopher and can finally start to see what reality actually is. And as the philosopher explores around, he gets to the third level, the thoughts or assumptions, or he gets to finally be able to look around and start to see the truth of things and understand it. But the light is still hurting his eyes, and he has to adjust. And finally, as the philosopher explores and gets to know the truth, he's able to stare directly at the sun, or the good, and finally contemplate the forms of the realities. And that is how Plato thinks the philosopher is born. The philosopher, he goes into this later, has these specific characteristics that allow him to escape from the cave, go out and understand reality. So that's only half of the cave, because Plato then goes into how the philosopher, being like this great person, will go back into the cave and try to save society from the dull reality and entrapment that they've been in. And that's what Plato thinks is the relationship between the philosopher and society. And it's quite sad because Plato's mentor, Socrates, is actually put to death by Athens. And it's almost Plato complaining about what actually happened in his life, and he thinking of Socrates as being the ultimate philosopher and the person who ultimately understands all the truth, being put to death by these foolish people who are at the lowest form of truth. And so as the philosopher tries to go back inside, the light has opened up his eyes to the truth, but he now goes back into the dim, dark cave and he can barely see. And as he goes back and talks to the prisoners and tells them of the great wonders of reality, they don't believe him and they call him foolish, and they tell him that the shadows are reality, that there's nothing outside of where they are, and that this is the utmost truth. And he's in the minority and no one believes him. And it's really very sad because this is what Plato thinks of reality in society, that there may be one or a small amount of individuals that understand the greatest truth because they've spent their entire lives thinking about it. But whenever they try to share it with other people, they're rejected and they're told that they're foolish and that they don't actually understand what reality is. And so that's the kind of idea Plato has about reality. And that's basically idealism, that apart from reality, there's the ideal of things. There's the form of things. And that is like crucial to everything Plato thinks about, because whenever he goes on to define anything, he looks for the form of it. Kind of like I said, the definition. What makes this itself? And that's important whenever you go to things like justice, because that's one of the most important things Plato defines in this book. And he ties that directly to the soul and so on. But
do we want to pause and see reactions? What do y'all think about Plato's forms?
Well, it's clear to me that he does not believe in the invisible or spiritual form, for one thing.
That he does not?
Right.
Okay, what makes you say that?
Because of the fact that it's not mentioned anywhere in this theory.
Yeah. I think he means this as a metaphor, though. So he's trying to use a physical metaphor to explain what he thinks about entering the realm of the forms.
Okay. So I assume that the light from the fire is what gives the philosopher lit it, because it gives some kind of form as to those shadow beliefs there.
Yeah, so the idea is these people are chained up, and what's causing the shadows is the fire shining on real objects. I don't know that the fire itself is particularly important, other than it creates the shadows, right?
I think it's just it's just the analogy of how it creates the shadows.
So if we go back here, the idea would be these are the shadows on the wall. You can see those. These are the actual, these things, whatever those are.
Objects.
So there's real objects. But then as you get out of the cave and you walk up here and see birds and the sun, you're entering into the ideal, true forms of what reality actually is, which is more real than even those objects in the cave.
You could almost make the argument that the fire is like a initiation into the intelligible realm, like almost like a fake form.
Yeah.
Good.
So it's interesting Garrett picked chair, because I don't think we talked about that in advance, but I think that's what my philosophy teacher used in like Philosophy 101 too. It's super common to talk about forms with something like a chair. To me, that is the least intuitive. So when I think of a chair, I'm not sure that I believe there is a form. So Plato seems to have thought there was a form of everything, and that's what's been hardest for me to understand is like, did he literally think there was like a place? But it's hard, place, it may not be physical if it's in your mind or if it's a spiritual reality, but like a place where all the forms eternally exist. Because if so, I don't think personally there's a form of a chair, right? Like, so these chairs have backs. That doesn't have a back, but maybe we call it a stool. When we go to track meets, we have chairs that fold up. Most chairs have 4 legs, but you could have a chair with 3. There's some like modern art chairs where the front 2 legs curve underneath, and so they really only have 2 legs. Like, are some of those less of a chair because the form of a chair is one thing, and if you don't perfectly adhere to the form, you're less. I just don't buy it with chairs, right? Like, I think we made up language and we made up words like stool and chair and recliner and bench and whatever, and I don't think there's a perfect form of that in eternity. But Garrett started going to justice, and that's where I think it gets really interesting, right? Like, when we see somebody do something, like maybe we hear the story of what a person did, maybe we actually see them do a thing, and we say, okay, that thing was just. So like we're seeing a physical instance of justice, but how do we know that it's just? Well, he would say because there's a perfect form of justice, and that's what justice is. And if we see a thing that we think is like justice, the reason we know it's just is because it's adhering more closely to the perfect ideal of what justice is. That, to me, makes a little more sense when you start to talk about it as like good or justice. The other one, sorry, I'm kind of rambling now, but to me as a math geek that I think is really interesting is, like, does the number 2 exist? Is that a real thing?
Or is it just a form?
Because you can never see the number 2, right? Like, you can have 2 apples, but you're not seeing the number 2. But what's interesting about math and physics is there are times when mathematicians move faster and they predict physics, and then we find it out later. So like Einstein predicted gravitational waves, and then students, including a group at ACU, detected them like almost 100 years later. But there are other times where the physics moves faster. Well, actually, maybe I said it backwards. Einstein was kind of doing physics. my point is, I'm getting a little tied up here. Sometimes the abstract physicists move faster and they predict what should exist, and then the math works. And sometimes the math moves faster and says what the physics should be, and then we figure out the physics really is. So to me, like, if math isn't actually real, like if there aren't actually numbers and mathematical rules, if it just, we happen to make up some language about two apples, we call it two, I don't think that would work. Like, the fact that math and physics so perfectly predict each other, to me, there's a real reality behind that, right? Like, we can say math is the mind of God, or how God put logic into the universe, or whatever, but like, however you want to say it, like, to me, I feel like there's an actual truth to math. And I don't know that the truth of math could be just here, if it really, really is true. Like, I think this is the number 2, right? This is the Pythagorean theorem, like that ideal concept. Or one more, I promise I'll stop with one more. If we keep it kind of within math, is there such a thing as a circle? In the real world, nothing is a perfect circle, right? A perfect circle has an infinite number of points. They're all exactly equidistant from the center. It's a smooth line. That clock looks like a circle, but if you get a magnifying glass and zoom in on it, it's not a circle, right? If there is such a thing as a circle, it's only here. Everything else in the world that looks like a circle is an approximation of a circle. So that's where I kind of think Plato makes some sense, right? Like, justice and math and geometry, those things, to the extent that they're real, the perfection of them is only in some conceptual or spiritual world. It's not within the physical world.
Well, the number 2 is mathematically what they consider a real number.
Yeah.
So,
Represents the quantity, representation.
Yeah.
I think there's also something here with risk reward. So the risk reward at the bottom is very low, and the risk reward at the top is very high if you get it right, if you get it wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we live, for the most part, at the bottom.
Yeah.
Where people averse to risk, not really, able to wrap our brains around the reward. But the higher we go up there, the reward increases, so does the risk. So I don't think of a chair, I think of an airplane. I can see it, I can see a picture of an airplane, I can touch an airplane and fly on it. There's thoughts and assumptions about how that airplane flies, and then there is a way that airplane flies. And so far, we've gotten a lot better at getting those airplanes flying. But we still have a ways to go. So.
Yeah.
Good morning. My mind is still wrapped around the comment that you made regarding the number 2, and then you see 2 apples.
Yeah.
I'm kind of stuck there, because that's a really good question.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see the 2 apples, but what about the number 2? That's kind of what my mind,
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure that out, because you said it, and then, it's a really good question.
Yeah, I think
How does it operate?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I mean, we talked about it a little bit, I think, with our first class on epistemology, which you weren't here for that one, but sort of like, what is truth and how do we know things? And I think we talked about it with gravity. So you can use apples again because of, Sir Isaac Newton. But if you see an apple fall, are you seeing gravity? No, I mean, you can't actually see gravity. And people didn't understand gravity for thousands of years. I mean, Aristotle was shockingly wrong about why things move the way that they move. But eventually, Isaac Newton figured out that gravity exists. So you can see the effect of gravity, but seeing the effect of gravity isn't exactly the same thing as seeing gravity. And so gravity is a concept that I think exists a little bit more like up here, You don't see it directly, but we believe it is an ultimate truth about how reality works in the universe. So yeah, the form is a weird phrase. To me, it's almost like the concept or the principle,
I see where you're going.
It's the idea of it. The reason this is called idealism is we're going to talk about what is the ultimate nature of reality. And to Plato, that's what's most real. He was an idealist. Whereas like a lot of atheist philosophers today, we would call them materialists. Because the idea is that like matter itself, physical matter, is the only thing that exists. That is the extent of reality, is physical matter. Or if you say nature is made up of matter and energy, you can call it naturalism. So sometimes materialism and naturalism are used interchangeably. So those are two kind of very different perspectives, right? That the ideal spiritual concept is the most real, or that matter is really the only thing that exists. And we'll look at dualism, which says that there are at least two types of things that exist. But
Can I
Yeah.
say something outside of the math, physics?
No. Yes, please.
Okay, so it just kind of blows my mind, like, if you look at a history timeline, where Plato falls and stuff, because I feel like if you think of the narrative in more of like a biblical perspective, like, God has called so many like individual people to show them the truth and then sent them back. And it follows that same pattern that Garrett was talking about how they call them foolish, how sometimes they won't follow them, how sometimes they break. Like, I think about, calling Abraham and calling Moses, and that all happened like before Plato, and then Plato made this metaphor, and all the prophets. But then, like, he's asking him, like, this already was a thought out there that I'm guessing because of the Roman occupation and everything that people maybe knew about it, that were more educated, even in the Jewish realm. And then Jesus kind of asks his apostles to do that same thing. Like, I am this ultimate teacher that shows you the truth, and I'm asking you, I'm going to keep sending you back. Like, even Paul, like, had to have even a more miraculous, like, showing of the truth. And then he got sent back, So anyway,
It's a little like the prophet never has honor in his own hometown.
Yes.
Like once he gets the special truth, he's ridiculed where
So
he's
I know
from.
it's not supposed to have Christian roots, but it's one of those, like, you found, is it Melchizedek? Like, you found somebody, like, you found this thing out in the universe that somebody approached by a different way, but really could have God covering it.
Yeah, I remember hearing it that as God was preparing the gospel for the world, he was also preparing the world for the gospel. And so, like, just because the Hebrews have special revelation that the Bible is the Word of God, doesn't mean that God wasn't allowing other people to see glimpses of truth too, right? The truth of God is evident from nature. Like, we believe all people have had bits of truth here and there, and this seems... Yeah, I don't know if y'all caught the, when Garrett was talking about the sun metaphor to the connection to the Trinity. Because, David talked about the Trinity a couple weeks ago, and when Garrett and I were talking about this, your teacher referred to it as the binity, right? So bi means two, so two instead of three. Plato didn't get all the way to a Trinity. But the idea is, if you want to know perfect truth, there's this one thing that really exists in the world of the forms that is the good, and that is the ultimate source of all truth and knowledge, the good. But how do we see a chair? It's only if the sun shines light. Well, how can we know anything in our minds? How can we have a concept of the truth of justice? We can't touch the good itself, and so it's only if that good sends light, thought light, spiritual light down to us, right? And so the way Plato talks about it, which I'm not doing a great job of re-articulating, it sounds a lot like the Father and the Son. There is the ultimate goodness, and then he sends truth down to humans so they can see. In the beginning was the Word, it's and so it's that idea that the way that we know anything is that the perfect good shines light down. Sounds a fair amount like we know the Father because the Son was sent down. And so it's just interesting that, this philosopher trying to think about the ultimate nature of reality seems to be tiptoeing, inching closer to some idea of God becoming incarnate with us, right? Revealing himself to us.
It's interesting because there's a decent or a lot of Platonic thought that's very close to Christianity, and he came before Christianity. And it's really interesting, and I really love that. But it's also important to ground ourselves in biblical evidence first and Platonic second, rather than Platonic first and biblical second. But just also, Plato talks about the just a lot, which I find really interesting. But one of his points about the just is that, like, the form of just or the true just person versus the seemingly just person who is not just on the inside. And in his talk about that, he ends it by saying, the person who seems just on the outside but not on the inside will be praised as if he were truly just by society. But the person who is fully just as its form or ideal self will be forsaken by society all the way to being crucified by society. And he says that in his book 400 years before Jesus is born.
You want to talk a little bit about his idea of the soul?
Yeah, so there was an interesting thought of Plato's that the individual and the city are completely parallel. So if you wanted to understand a person in Houston, you could understand Houston and you would perfectly understand the person that lives there. Or if you wanted to understand Houston, you could look at someone that lives there and perfectly understand Houston. And that goes back to Plato's idea of the soul. And so when trying to define justice, Plato is unable to do that at first. And so in his book, he has them try to define justice in the society first because he thinks it'll be easier since society in the city is bigger. And they end up saying that in the ideal society, there will be three parts: the ruling class or guardians, the defending, like police force / enforcers, the auxiliaries, and then the working class. And he says there are four virtues that we can find here, which is wisdom, courage, self-discipline, and then finally justice. And he says that if the ruling class exemplifies wisdom, the policing class exemplifies courage, whenever all classes obey each other in harmony, that exemplifies self-discipline. And whenever all classes are doing those three things to the best of their ability and doing their role, that is justice in the city. And then he goes on to say it works the same in the individual, that in the soul, there are three parts of your soul. There is your animalistic desires, which is like the working class, which drives you to eat, to sleep. There is your humanistic desires or spirit, which drives you to things such as honor and wealth. And then there is your thought, your rationale, which allows you to control the rest of your soul, to think about things logically and understand everything. And that is your wise ruling class. And then he goes on to defend how both of those are parallel and how those, once again, in the individual, if you are exemplifying these virtues correctly and if they are working or doing that role, then you are just and you will act justly. And then it's very interesting to me because he goes on after that to talk about different governments, like democracy and tyranny and so on. And then he talks about how basically the three parts of the city are basically turned around in different ways for each society that has gone wrong. And then he relates it back to the individual who is a part of that society and shows how the same parts are in the wrong way again and how that affects them in reality. So to use the tyranny example, which is what Plato describes as the worst and most unjust form that there could be. He says the society of the tyrannical is basically when one person gains all the power and puts everyone else into servitude in a way. And so he says the soul is whenever the appetite or your animalistic desires basically takes control of it as basically a tyrant over the rest of your soul, overruling your rationale and overruling your humanistic desires. And he says the tyrannical person or the unjust person will be driven by animalistic desires and will succumb to their lusts or their desires and will never be happy in life because they will only seek things that are not fulfilling. And so I find it really interesting because no one would ever think to compare the city and the individual and say, these are the same. Like in philosophy, there's the how to be the best individual, which is ethics, and there's how to be the best society, which is politics. And Plato says, no, those are the exact same. The city and the individual are the same. And so that's really interesting, and how he goes back to the soul and ties it into like the three parts. And because that's a Platonic idea of the soul, the three parts: the rationale, the humanistic desires, and the animalistic desires.
Some of that will tie back into your image, the cave image that you had. And I kind of see sort of I see a spiritual nature and a humanistic nature in that. The sunshine obviously is the natural light. That would be sort of the spiritual realm. The true shadows, non-distorted shadows. But as you get down into the cave, you have a fire, which is a human creation, or something that's humanly developed. And you might call it enlightenment from someone who feels enlightened. And you have the three guys down there that are casting the shadows, which becomes reality to these people trapped. And so their view of reality is simply the shadow of someone who considers himself enlightened, which is kind of indoctrinating the people, society, I guess, in this analogy. Whereas, ultimately the goal is to look to the source of ultimate enlightenment, perhaps. I don't know if that kind of ties in a little bit with what you were saying.
So the thing that I want to challenge us to think differently about is actually the idea of the soul. And this goes all the way back to when I was in college. I really loved Western philosophy, but I didn't know much about the ancient kind of Hebrew worldview. And Randy Harris said something to me one day about how the modern Christian idea of the soul tends to be more Platonic than biblical. And I had no idea what he meant, but it sounded interesting to me. And so I've spent, the last 20 years trying to understand that. And I think there's something to it. And so as I walk through this, you're either going to say, like, of course, like, that's nothing new, or I'm going to irritate you a little bit because you like thinking about the soul the way you think about it. So I don't know which one, if you already think this or if I'm going to annoy you. But part of Plato's idealism is that he thinks who we are in our essence is an eternal soul. We are inherently eternal. The soul is inherently eternal. It will exist forever, and that is us. And the soul just happens to be temporarily trapped in a physical body, but the physical is not great, and the soul is the ultimate. But when we look at how the Bible describes what humans are, it starts with creation, where it says in Genesis 2:7, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." And I think that in the Hebrew worldview, creation is really critical. Like, if you think about what the Jews based their view on, maybe the most important thing was the Exodus, right? Like, they were the people of the Exodus. But after that was probably creation. Like, they worshiped the only uncreated God who created everything else, and creation is really important. And God created the world because he wanted to. And he looked at it, and when it was all done all together, he said it's very good, right? And we are created of the world, in the world, part of the world. We're part of this creation, right? And that becomes an ongoing theme throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and into the New Testament as well. So like Psalm 104:30 says to God, "When you send forth your spirit," which is the closest Hebrew word we have to a soul. So like when Plato talked about the soul, the closest Hebrew word to that would be ruach, which means spirit or breath or wind. "When you send forth your spirit, they are created." So how is it that anything's created? Well, God is spirit, and God sends forth his spirit, and then creation happens, right? But then how do we think about death? It's sort of the reverse of that. So Psalm 90, verse 3 says to God, "You turn people back to dust." And so some funerals, especially in more liturgical traditions, but a lot of Christian funerals or Ash Wednesday will say from dust to dust. Right? We're created from dust in Genesis 2. Psalm 90 says death is a return to dust. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. And then a little bit of a longer excerpt from Psalm 103 here. I liked this one, verses 13 through 16. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. He knows how we are formed. He remembers we are dust. So what is part of God's compassion on us is his understanding that part of our essence, who we are, how we do things, is related to the fact that we were formed from dust. This is still important, right? This is how God views us, people of dust. The life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more. All right, just a few more. I think one more about death, and then we're going to turn to the hope of future life. So I think the last one I've got about death is Job 34. So it's talking about how God could just undo all of the creation he's created, basically. He sent his spirit out to create. He could undo it. So it says, if he, God, should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. So what I think is interesting about that is Plato wouldn't have believed that. Plato thinks we are, in our own essence, inherently immortal. Our soul is immortal. What I think this verse is saying is we all depend on God moment to moment for our ongoing existence. This, in him you live and move and have your being. You know, God is what sustains us. And if God just decided not to sustain us anymore, we're unsustained, right? We go back to dust without God. And so we really do depend on God. God is the only inherently immortal, eternal thing. And it's because of his ongoing sustaining of us that we can be too. But we depend on him. Well, yeah, so I said it was the last one about death. I guess this one kind of is. Ecclesiastes, which has a lot to do with death and futility, you know, if you've studied Ecclesiastes. But speaking of the nature of death, it says, the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. So this idea that we are this commingled thing of the dust of the earth and God's spirit. Like those two things together create us, right? But then Isaiah, I love because it's kind of looking forward to the hope we see in the New Testament. Isaiah 26:19 says, but your dead will live, Lord. Their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. And so I don't think I'll read these unless y'all want to dive into them and we have time, which we probably could. But in the New Testament, I love 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 8 because they, I think, continue on this theme. So 1 Corinthians 15 is where Paul, after having ridiculed the Corinthians for lots of things, right? Sexual immorality and how they partake of the Lord's Supper and how they're divided over following Peter and Apollos, he finally basically says, you cannot be a Christian if you don't believe in the resurrection. Like he didn't say anything before chapter 15 about them not being Christian. And then he's like, look, some of you are saying there's no resurrection. But if that's true, we're to be pitied because we have hope for this life only. You have to believe in bodily resurrection. Jesus was raised from the dead as the first fruits, and our hope is to be raised as he was. And then there's lots of confusing language about how we're transformed into a spiritual body, and but the fundamental metaphor he's relying on is resurrection. Jesus was actually raised, and that's how we know we have hope of resurrection too. And yes, we will be transformed, and the new life will be different, but that difference will start with resurrection. Okay, so why does this matter? Maybe it's nuance. I don't know if it's a big deal or not. But to me, we love to say things like, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. If we take Genesis 1 and 2 seriously, I think this world is our home. It's just really broken, right? And we know that the new creation, as described in Revelation, will be different. So I'm not saying this world is going to just be the same forever. It'll be different. But in some real, I think, important sense, we were created in this world, and it was a good thing. It just happens to be under enemy occupation, so to speak. So I'm not a huge Sound of Music fan, but I've certainly seen it a few times. And I was trying to think of a metaphor for this, and I thought a little bit of like the German occupation of Austria, right? So the main father figure in The Sound of Music is like a proud Austrian, and he does not want to become a German. Like, he's very unhappy about the Germans moving into Austria. And so if you fast forward, they escaped, but theoretically a couple years, if they had stayed there and it was fully under Nazi control, and you had asked him, is this your home? Yes? No? Like, it's still the land, it's still Austria, but it's kind of not my home anymore. That's sort of how I feel, right? Like, is the earth our home? Yeah, like we were created of the dust of the earth, but it's also Satan's realm now, right? Like, we are supposed to be in this resistance against the powers and principalities of darkness. But it's not that we are somehow some Platonic soul that just got put here accidentally, temporarily, and we don't belong here. Like, we belong here in a sense. It's just gone badly, and we need God to redeem it and restore it. Or one more that I've heard, just to pick on common Christian phrases, which, again, I don't know who loves them and who doesn't, but I've heard it said, we are not, how was it worded? We are not a physical creature having spiritual experiences. We are a spiritual creature that happens right now to be having a physical experience. Again, I don't quite buy that. I think we are, in a very real sense, physical creatures. Now, also spiritual, because God sent His Ruach, His Spirit, to create us. But again, to think we are only some Platonic soul that just happens to be temporarily trapped in a body, just having physical experiences as a weird anomaly, is not what I think creation says in Genesis 1 and 2. And so anyway, what did Randy Harris mean by that comment? I don't know for sure, but I think that Plato could draw this really sharp distinction between body and soul, and that we are soul, and body is kind of bad and temporary. We're just, entombed in a body for a little while, but we will eventually be pure soul. And I think the Hebrew idea of who we are is more holistic, in that we can identify different words to describe pieces of us, the way, like in modern English, we might talk about personality and character and whatever. So we're heart and mind and soul, body, spirit. Like, we can describe all those things, but it's all together. Like, we are dust and spirit, right? We are heart, mind, soul, body. And God's hope for the future is resurrection. And so I don't know. To me, that's different enough to matter in at least some sense. I've rambled a long time. Maybe I'll just pause and get reactions. Is that how you've always thought of it? Is that the first time you've ever heard of it? Do you hate that idea? Are you intrigued by that idea? What do you think about the way we think of the nature of our body, our soul, who we are? Am I right to draw a distinction with Plato? Or?
Well, I've seen it. People look at that, and it's sort of like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Yeah.
And make these distinctions between that.
Mm.
In reality, if you think about strength as being your body,
Mm-hmm.
we're to love God with everything we have, because He created us as one, not as parts.
Yeah.
And I think that's some of the difficulty that people have. They want to make this separation, and in reality, there's no separation.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, so it's not a big deal. But anyway, the idea that resurrection, obviously, we're coming back with the body. He doesn't talk about coming back with the spirit. We're coming with the body. The body's got to go somewhere.
Yeah.
It has to have some type of firm place to go, not a cloud.
Right.
So.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I will see it as
we are what our, I'm not Clark. I was told that I'm Clark. I was told that I'm a part of this family growing up, that I'm a part of this thing, and you sort of are a lot of the pieces of what you are told that you are. And I think sort of the growing out of the cave is almost determining, oh, I'm this soul, this essence, this thing. It's almost determining what your life is, what you make of your actual soul essence. In some ways, overcoming who you're told that you are and actually determining who you actually are. That was confusing how I said that. But, I guess that's how I kind of see it.
Okay.
I was kind of thinking it there before even getting into the resurrection perspective. But sort of the overcoming who you're told that you are.
So kind of true self, false self.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of how a good way to describe how I
Okay.
perceive it.
Huh?
I think, on a different note from like where he was going, kind of what you were saying earlier, I think that if we had this idea, like Plato thinks of soul and physical being very separate from one another versus together, it takes away from some of the responsibility of the physical.
Yeah.
So you can see how when we think that way, and we think this way of like, this isn't my, I don't belong here, I'm a Christian, I don't belong here, my world is elsewhere. I don't need to do X, Y, and Z to take care of the physical of myself or of the people around me or of the earth. You know, like it can all be, it just takes away some of that responsibility if you see it all together as wrapped up into one and one goodness and one creation that are all interdependent and interwoven. You can't have one without the other. Then we have to care for it differently, but the form might look different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
To open another can of worms, you mentioned the songs, and there's a lot more songs, but we talk about we're going to go to heaven. And in reality, when you in Scripture, heaven's always coming down.
Mm-hmm.
It's God coming to do on earth
As
what
it
is
is
done
in heaven.
It's
Yeah.
not the opposite. So it's always coming down.
Yeah.
It's always coming here. God is coming here. He wants to be among his people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the illustrations of the tabernacle, the temple, the Spirit, Jesus, always coming, walking in the garden, right?
Yeah.
Creation. He wants to be among us.
Yeah, and the New Jerusalem in Revelation, right? I think we're often scared of Revelation because it seems so complicated to understand. But I mean, if you look at how eternal life is described in Revelation, it's God sending the New Jerusalem down as the new creation. Yeah.
I look at a lot of things through the lens of business, and when I invest in a company, I'm giving a piece of myself to that company. And then that company, I'm expecting that company then to take everything that it has and go get a return. But a piece of myself has gone with the company, even though I'm not necessarily, in the day-to-day of the company. And so when I read Job 34:14-15, I think about calling in the loan.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think about. I think about, okay, if I just decided today I'm going to pull my investment out, that company ceases to exist, and everything about it, it can't do what it was supposed to do anymore. If God decided to, if he set it in his heart to gather himself and his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together. So if he called in the loan, that would be the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at it kind of like this investment that's made in us. This physical body is meant to do work. It's meant to do something.
Mm.
It has a purpose. And this is an investment that the Creator has made in us. And if he decides to, call it in one day, then, and we haven't used that investment wisely.
Yeah.
What have we done?
Yeah.
And that's just my simple-minded view on the world. I just look at the world a lot that way.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring up one last thing when we have 5 minutes left. I know we could probably do a whole discussion for an hour on this topic, but I told you at the beginning we were going to talk about the idea of dualism. So dualism is just the idea that there are at least two fundamental types of things that really do exist. And so the most common would be matter and spirit, right? Physical matter and soul. And so I would say I am fundamentally dualistic, and I think the Bible supports that, right? There's God's ruach, there's spirit, but there's also physical creation that he made, and so both are true. One of the most common ways that's explored in philosophy is the mind-brain problem. The idea that is your mind, which is sort of at this level, right? Is your mind the same as your 3 pounds of mushy matter in between your ears, right? Your brain. And that's actually really hard philosophically, because what philosophers, including atheist philosophers, try to understand is the qualitative nature of consciousness. What it means to actually feel pain, to actually feel an emotion, or to be aware of your own existence, right? To think, who am I? Why do I exist? That is hard to understand what it is and where it comes from. And if you think that all we are is brain neurons with electricity firing between them, the nature of consciousness itself is really, really hard to get at philosophically. Like, to the extent that there's one modern atheist philosopher who thinks the fundamental nature of the universe is consciousness itself rather than matter. So he doesn't base it in God, it's not a spiritual thing, but he just thinks like the building block of reality is actually consciousness, which I don't even know how to understand that, but like that's how hard the problem is a lot of people think you can't just reduce it to matter. And so what's interesting to me about that is there was a debate like just over 25 years ago between a philosopher and I think he was like a neuroscientist about whether we would solve the hard problem of human consciousness. And they said that one said we would do it in 25 years and one said we wouldn't, and they bet like an expensive case of wine or something. And they've now settled that bet that we didn't solve it. So 25 years later, we had no answer. So the philosopher who thought we would not have an answer won the bet. And so that's interesting to me as we get into things like AI, right? There's all this talk about will AI become conscious? And I think too many computer scientists are operating at like this level of understanding of what consciousness even is. How we would ever know whether something else has an experience of pain or a self-aware thought is so hard, but so fundamental to our own experience, right? Like when I touch a hot stove, I pull my hand away and I feel pain. We could create an android where we put temperature sensors in its skin and we program it to move its hand as soon as it hits a certain threshold, but would it feel pain? You know, and that's that duality, right? Like we know that we do, and so mind, brain, we know they interact too, right? Like if somebody has a brain injury, it can change their personality, but we still think the brain itself is not the whole story, right? That there is mind there, which maybe is another way that Plato was helpful in articulating how it can kind of vary. Yeah.
I've got something to share on that regarding the AI. For me specifically, when you say AI, what comes to my mind is it's artificial, and for me, sincerely, I need authentic. So for me, the difference for me would be whether you put that hand over that fire, is it on authentic versus artificial? Yeah. You know, there's a huge difference. Yeah. I mean, when I say that, I'm kind of questioning the AI. I'm learning a lot about it, but I'm just not sold on it. Yeah. I'm really not, because I'm a genuine type of person and I need something that's authentic, not artificial.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, you just ruined some movies and TV programs.
No, I mean, philosophy can seem so abstract, but as we get into things like AI, I think this is really important. We didn't get into it too much with ethics, but with ethics we talked about the trolley problems. Like, they seem ridiculous. When am I ever going to decide whether to pull a lever to kill one person on the tracks versus 5. But think about self-driving cars.
Do you protect the driver that bought you or the pedestrian on the street?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, that programming has to be in there, right? If the Tesla is driving on a narrow bridge and 2 pedestrians run out in front of it, what does it do? You have to program at least some level of ethics into stuff like that. And so philosophy meets the real world. I mean, we actually act on this stuff in some ways.
There's transhumanism too, as well.
Yeah.
The idea of you make your brain.
Upload your brain? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, on that, I probably have to let y'all go. Thanks for being here for this weird ride.